Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Hello. My name is Ben Furness. I'm the Executive Director of the 2030 Project, a university-wide climate research initiative based out of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. I really appreciate all of you being here today. I know it's a beautiful day outside, but this is a really important conversation, and I appreciate you coming to participate. This is the inaugural Climate Impact Speaker Series that the 2030 Project is helping to put on. And I'm really pleased to have our very first guest, Aliya, who's the Vice President of U.S. Policy and Advocacy for Breakthrough Energy. Breakthrough Energy advocates for an ambitious climate and clean energy policy agenda in the United States with the goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. She oversees multiple strategies to advance Breakthrough Energy's policy goals, including coalition building, policymaker education, political engagement, and policy communications. Prior to joining Breakthrough Energy, Aliya was the Federal Climate Policy Director at the National Resources Defense Council. She managed NRDC's advocacy work to defend existing federal climate safeguards and to advance new federal action both in Congress and through existing executive authorities. Aliya holds a master's degree in environmental engineering from Yale, but before that, she holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University, class of 03. So Aliya, welcome back to Cornell. It's really lovely to have you here.
Thanks, Ben. Can you all hear me? Is this working? Great. Should I have a clicker? Wonderful. Well, thank you all for having me. My name is Aliya. As Ben said, I'm the Vice President for U.S. Policy and Advocacy at Breakthrough Energy. Breakthrough was founded by Bill Gates almost 10 years ago now, and the purpose of Breakthrough is to bring together technology, policy, and markets on clean energy with the aim of getting to net zero emissions by 2050, decarbonize the entire global economy, and think about how do we solve energy poverty in the world. I will say this. Getting to Ithaca from Washington, D.C. is not that easy. So the main reason I'm here is because Ben asked me to come, and I started my time in the climate movement here at Cornell. So when the reason I decided to come to this school was because I had already decided I want to do the environment for the rest of my life, and Cornell seemed like it had the best mix of programs for that. But the thing and in the classroom and all the activities I did contributed to that. My most favorite thing that I did was working in the student group called Kyoto Now, which when I was here, our goal was to get the Cornell administration to commit to Kyoto Protocol standards, which was 7% below 1990 levels, which when I think of that now feels extremely quaint, very cute. I assume Cornell has a carbon neutral commitment, net zero commitment now, right? When we started that campaign, it was really hard. We had to fight like hell to get the administration to listen to us. There was a sit-in for several days outside Day Hall, which is the top photo here. And then, eventually the administration realized that the Board of Trustees was coming to visit Cornell the week later, so they had to get these kids out of the way. So they made a commitment to reduce carbon emissions. And I love this quote because it says so much in the commitment, right? It's let there be no mistake about it. A reduction of greenhouse gas emissions attributable to campus activities to levels 7% less than what they were in 1990 will not only be very difficult, it may be unable to be reached despite our best efforts, which I think I find very amusing because to me, I'm like, it doesn't really say we have conviction, we're gonna do this thing, we're excited. It's really like we've been dragged into doing this and now we have to reduce our emissions. But I really, really enjoyed doing that work because it did set the stage for Cornell to start becoming a real leader on sustainability and on climate change. We worked at the Kyoto, there was a task force the following few years to figure out how do you actually reduce emissions on campus, and it was extremely rewarding to me to be able to do that work here. But so I will say, one of the reasons I wanted to come here is where I started being in the climate movement, and I've been reflecting a lot on what is where are we now after more than 20 years of, for me, working on this for more than 20 years. And so that's me in that circle right there, So, I think about myself then. I was a pretty impatient person and was pretty dedicated. I wasn't going to give up on anything. But I really, really wanted Cornell to stop polluting greenhouse gases. I really wanted Cornell to stop using fossil fuels. And we were going to do anything we had to get there. So fast forward 22 years now, I'm still actually pretty impatient, and I'm still, it's really hard to get me to give up on a thing. So that's still consistent. But I actually think about this in a totally different way now. Whereas before I used to think about we need to stop polluting, we need to stop using fossil fuels like coal and oil. I now think about this as we're in a race to build as much clean energy as possible, and we need to make sure clean energy is cheap enough that we can outcompete the fossil fuels. And while those things seem like they're basically the same, they're actually pretty different approaches. And if you remember nothing from the talk, this is the one thing that I want you to take away from this, which is climate action is actually, it's not about stopping stuff. Solving climate change is just about building clean energy as fast as we can and getting it to be as cheap as possible. And also, after departing from Cornell, my first, the first 20 years of my career were working for major environmental NGOs, as Ben mentioned. I did a lot of advocacy work, campaign work, political work, policy work. And the groups that I worked for were really focused on stopping deforestation, and for a century, the environmental movement was focused on stopping degradation of wild land, stopping water pollution, stop acid rain, stop air quality, smog. And that's actually been pretty effective for much of the century. A lot of our major actions in Congress have been oriented around those calls for action. But now we need a different way of thinking, and we have to approach this in a totally different way. Let me talk a little bit more about why I feel like this is a paradigm shift that's really crucial to embrace. The first point here is climate is just intertwined with global poverty and with energy demand. The core here is, this is GDP per capita versus electricity consumption. There are no countries that have high GDP per capita that don't use a lot of energy. This is the whole game on how do we solve climate change. We can't do it without figuring out how all these folks in the bottom left corner, how do those countries move up this curve? Their demand for energy is going to increase as their economies develop, as they try to pull people out of poverty. GDP per capita, that correlates pretty strongly with things like high literacy rates, with low child mortality, with life expectancy, with reported life satisfaction, right? We can't expect that these countries won't move in that direction. That will take energy. There's no other way to solve climate change without figuring out how do you make fossil fuels how do you make clean energy cheaper than fossil fuels so that those countries, as they are lifting people out of poverty, can afford the clean energy solution, right? They're not going to pay more for clean energy as they develop. And then this is just to hammer that point home on the energy demand, that this is global energy consumption over time. And roughly today, even after huge pushes on clean energy, 80% of global energy demand is still met with fossil fuels. So as you imagine that curve going up and up and up further and further, we have to figure out how do we smush out all the current fossil fuels? We have to get rid of all those fossil fuels. And then as the curve goes up, we have to also grow the amount of clean energy that's necessary around the globe. So this is probably one of the hardest problems. This is maybe the hardest problem of humanity. Maybe there's another one, but this one is, it's a real pickle to figure out how do we make sure people can come out of poverty, have access to the energy that they need, and not destroy the climate. And then here I just want to make the point that every country, every region of the world has a different energy mix depending on what their resource mix looks like. But ultimately, fossil fuels are still super, super strong in almost every region. Like the sampling of regions shows that like basically fossil fuels are cheap, they're abundant, they are easily movable, easily transportable, they're super energy dense. So there's a reason that our whole economy is powered by fossil fuels. We benefit deeply from the fact that we're able to power the whole economy this way. So biggest point here is clean energy has to be cheaper and has to be more accessible than fossil fuels for us to be able to solve climate. And pretty much the only way to do that is through innovation, right? Because right now, in most cases, clean energy is more expensive than the fossil energy source. Innovation is the one way to like actually bring those costs down. So again, fossil fuels touches literally every aspect of our daily life, right? Like everything from electricity, how we move around, every single product we have, every building that you are in, everything you eat, all of fossil fuels is behind every single part of the economy. That's where all the greenhouse gases are coming from, is just every single economic sector there. And the number of solutions we need then is everything that is in this pie chart. Every single way that we're using energy needs to be a clean solution. So that goes way beyond just like wind and solar, but that also goes to how do you make cement? How do you make steel? How do you power airplanes? How do you fly airplanes? Like there's just a huge range of solutions that we still need to figure out how to invent and also scale up. And this is the innovation curve. This is the learning curve, right? So solar and wind have been a huge success story where you see how like solar back in the early days in 1975 was over $100 per watt, and now it's down to like less than $1 per watt over a 30-year time frame. This is the learning curve, right? So like as you build more of it, you learn efficiencies, it becomes cheaper over time. Now solar and onshore wind are cost competitive with fossil fuels. That's what we have to do across like dozens of different solutions that are currently super expensive, and we can't wait 30 or 40 years. Like, our goal is to get to net zero globally by 2050. If we're gonna actually do that by 2050, which turns out kind of around the corner, we can't wait 40 years to get these solutions to scale. And then this is the point of even in the situation of wind and solar, where it is already cost competitive. This is the market clearing for, I think it's for this is like, I think PJM did this. Renewables are actually the cheapest energy source, electricity source for electricity markets. So they clear first. They're the first thing that the grid operator will pick when they're dispatching electricity. But then, as soon as the demand starts to go up, you start going to other kinds of energy sources, generation sources. This is where renewables are intermittent. They are not located where you need the electrons, right? They're where it's sunny or windy, which is often in rural places out in the middle of nowhere, but you need the electrons like in the cities where the people live and where you're making the things. So it's very hard for us to build transmission, and it's very hard for us to have really strong reliability with intermittent sources. So that means we need some kind of energy storage, which we don't have great solutions for. We need some kind of clean, firm power, which means it's dispatchable, which could be like nuclear, geothermal, or maybe even fusion. I've been trying to talk up fusion lately. It's like worth thinking about. So even in the power sector, where I would argue over my career, most of the focus has been on power sector decarbonization, there is so far to go in innovation to make sure we actually decarbonize the grid fully. All right, next point. In the last few years, we passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of my wrinkles and my sense of post-traumatic stress come from trying to get those laws passed over the last few years, so you can ask me later about that. But these, I cannot stress enough the historic moment it was that these things are now law. So between these two, let me just go here. So between those laws, we have something on the order of $500 billion of federal funding to go into clean energy. And so before I did this job, like I would say millions, billions, trillions, like numbers sort of just like wash over me in this way that like, oh yeah, it sounds like a big number. I can't stress how big 500 billion is. I mean, it is bananas. It is cuckoo bananas to have $500 billion of federal money. And I like, prior to this time frame, like in 2018, if someone had said to me like, what'd be a cool idea is if we got like a bill through Congress that just like, I don't know, did like hundreds of billions of dollars of spending for clean energy, they would have been laughed out of the room. We'd have been like, thank you so much. Please stop wasting our time. But like things change, like politics change. We were able to get that done. And this is just like an incredible moment in history for this pivot from thinking about like, how do we stop pollution? How do we stop doing bad things? How do we stop fossil fuels? To how do we utilize this funding? How do we utilize this money to build things? Like this is money for clean energy projects to get steel in the ground and do real infrastructure projects. How do we actually do that? So just a quick note on the Inflation Reduction Act. So, so many stories to this, but ultimately it was on the order of $369 billion for things like clean electricity generation, electric vehicles, clean manufacturing, hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel, carbon dioxide removal, and it included things other than climate and energy. All of these, I guess, they're meant to be green, they're kind of gray. The gray-green bubbles are the New York Times version of like stuff that's for climate, and then there was also like some healthcare things that were in this bill too that you can see are well dwarfed by the amount of climate spending that was in the bill. And then for the bipartisan infrastructure law, again, this was more for kind of like earlier stage demonstration of technology. So things like clean hydrogen, which is not really produced at this point, but is a potential source of energy for things where we can't use electricity. There's a lot of money for like industrial decarbonization demonstrations, for carbon removal hubs. So that's another huge chunk of money for clean energy development that is really significant. And then this is just to show like what the innovation curve looks like and where the funding is going, right? So when you think about a new technology or an early stage technology, it often starts with R&D. That might be private money, but often it's government funded R&D. And then you might need to do like more demonstration and applied work. You start getting like early adoption, and then you start to see more deployment. So there's different types of federal spending that helps in those different parts of the curve. But ultimately, in the early stages, you really do need someone who's willing to take risks, and often that someone is the government, because it's a public good to get to this clean energy. Private investment often doesn't want to deal with these like valleys of death or these parts of the risk curve that are not sure they're going to get a return. So that's why this funding is so crucial. Like you can't get over the hump with moving these technologies forward and making them cheaper without having some policy and support. And ultimately, the goal of this is just how do we get that innovation cycle, that learning curve, to shrink by several decades? Like how do we make things go from like an idea in a lab to commercial scale as fast as possible? And then how do we also, once it's actually at scale and cost competitive, then how do you accelerate the deployment and get it out there as quickly as you can so it's actually getting a huge market share? So the main thing that I've been thinking about, again, like having come into the climate movement here at Cornell and having been in it for many decades, is I'm just seeing that this inflection point that's been created by the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law is that it's calling for like a new effort. We need a new way to meet this moment. And so just to like take a step back from climate and just thinking about like the environmental movement, back in the 1900s timeframe, environmentalism really kind of started with like the Teddy Roosevelt's, national parks, conservation, push to like preserve places. White dudes really like to go hunting. Let's make sure that we have places for them to do that. And then like, you see that through to like the 1970s timeframe where rivers were catching on fire. People could see the smog and were having trouble like actually seeing like across the landscape. People were like palpably seeing the pollution in front of them. And so like public health became much more of the push in the environmental movement of how do you stop this pollution? How do you make sure we're protecting public health? Because that was palpable to the public. So like in that 1970 timeframe, you see the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, TSCA, Superfund happens in the 80s. And a lot of the organizations that we know today were founded in that same timeframe, either pushing for or to like enforce those laws. And then what I'm kind of arguing for here is like, there's like a third wave that we need now in the environmental movement that's really actually truly climate focused. And I think a lot of groups, the groups that I've used to work at and the groups that folks I'm very good friends with, they currently define what people think of as the climate movement. But again, there's a difference between stopping things and building things. And we have to move to this building frame. So on the climate side, there's, the timeline is really still mostly in the stopping pollution frame. It's, like the UNFCCC is formed, the Kyoto Protocol is all about like how do we reduce emissions, get these targets. That's still obviously with the Paris Agreement, and the next set of nationally determined contribution commitments will be like a lot of this, Waxman-Markey failed in 2010, also gray hairs from that, but again, that was a cap and trade bill, which is all about like capping pollution and bringing pollution down. But then you get to the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. That's where we start to see the pivot toward like, oh, we should be investing. We should be building and investing in clean energy, which is just a different, totally different approach. So I'm kind of billing this as what I call like a clean economy movement, right? The old kind of environmental conservation groups tend to think about like pollution control and like opposition to industry, often kind of like anti-growth or anti-technology. But the clean economy movement really has to be thinking about investment, economic growth, community development. How do we do big projects? How do we build big things again? And there's overlap with that for sure, but it is actually a fairly different thing. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring this message to Cornell is like I started in the climate movement here, and to the extent that you all are going to be doing work to solve climate change, I implore you to be thinking about that side of the Venn diagram. So, a clean economy movement. So I think of this as something that pushes for policy, pushes for investment to make sure we're building these clean industries and globally, right? Like you can't only think about that in the context of a parochial interest or one nation. It has to be thought of as like, how are you building these industries in a way that can spread across continents and across geographies? So one way I like to think about this is, so this is Bloomberg New Energy Finance released a report a few months ago on like how much is it going to cost to get to a net zero economy. So they were estimating, and honestly I can't tell you if this analysis is good or not, but BNEF is generally a good source. But $215 trillion is what they roughly say is the price tag for a net zero economy, which, good news, is only $40 trillion above the baseline. But I don't have $40 trillion, and I don't know if anyone here knows anyone that has $40 trillion. I mean, I work for Bill Gates. He does not have that much money. So who's going to pay that? Like, where does that additional $40 trillion actually come from? Because if you can get to so that green line is that economic transition scenario, which is the development of these low-income and middle-income countries, like moving out of poverty and increasing their GDP per capita. Who pays the $40 trillion to make sure that that's a decarbonized way of evolving? That's what a clean economy movement needs to figure out. It's either we have to figure out how to pay for that $40 trillion, or we figure out how to reduce that amount of money so that you don't actually have to pay that much more. One way or the other, like that's the challenge ahead of us. And then I want to just give like an example of how one might think about what a clean economy movement might look like. So, this is a shameless plug for Bill Gates and his investment in TerraPower. And just to be clear, I don't work for TerraPower, and Breakthrough Energy is totally separate from TerraPower, but TerraPower is an advanced nuclear company that is just broke ground in Wyoming on a 4th-generation nuclear reactor. I'm not a physicist, but there's probably other people in here who could explain the technology better than me. But basically, instead of using a light water reactor, they're using a sodium reactor. So they're using sodium to cool the facility. It should, in theory, it should be much safer, much cheaper than current nuclear facilities, and would be built a lot faster in theory. So they are now in the midst of building that first demonstration project. So it'll be a totally zero carbon way to make clean, firm electricity. It is both federal funding and private investors going. It's a 50-50 cost share between private investors and the Department of Energy. So they're sharing that risk together. They are using unionized labor under a project labor agreement. So they're working with the IBEW to build the plant. So they're trying to really ensure that the jobs that they're creating are good family-sustaining jobs. And they're building it in a rural community that is coal dependent. So has been traditionally dependent on coal mining and also has a coal plant that's slated for retirement in about 10 years. So that's the kind of, when I think of what a clean economy movement looks like, it looks like community development. It looks like you're bringing good jobs to a place. It looks like the federal governments and private sector working together to actually solve the clean energy transition problem. And you're also looking at new technologies, new ways to do things, rather than just using the old ways. So again, when I think of this movement, I think of increasing. How do we increase more investment, private investment into clean technologies? How do you push governments to be doing those investments, but also doing the regulations and the policy to disincentivize greenhouse gases? But also, the third piece I think is the most important one, which is how do you mobilize communities and the workforce to want to be part of this clean energy transition? And as we start, if we're lucky enough to see the rapid change that we need to see in order to solve for climate, there will be a lot of local skepticism at best in terms of people's landscapes and communities changing. So how do we change that? How do we make it so that people embrace that and want to see that change rather than resist it? And how do we make sure they benefit from it? That's the more important thing. Okay, and then this is my last slide. I leave you with this. We just need this new movement as soon as possible. So ideally before November, but if that's not possible, I put this here just to note that elections have consequences. Many people worked very hard to get these historic new laws in place that established $500 billion federal dollars for clean energy. This is a huge historical global turning point in terms of the climate fight to have that kind of investment coming from the US. And we can't lose it next year. So regardless of the election outcome, many of us are working on how do we prepare for keeping all of this stuff intact, making sure it doesn't get taken away next year. But that would be a lot easier if we had a really strong movement of folks in communities and companies and NGOs working together to say, we're ready for this clean energy transition because it makes good jobs, it's good for community development, and it's good for our country. So that would be great. So if anyone's ready to do that, please come see me after. So, and that's it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Aliya. That was terrific. We're just going to chat for a little while, and then we can open it up for questions. I was really interested to hear a little bit about your own ideological journey from your days at Cornell and the Kyoto Now movement to this clean economy vision and much more proactive and building oriented and tech forward. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that trajectory and that journey and maybe any milestones along the way that shaped your thinking on this.
Yeah. Well, honestly, when I was at Cornell, I took so many different kinds of classes. Most of them were science or kind of socially focused. And I only took one economics class, and I just hated it. So I just didn't do it again. And when you go into the environmental space, the environmental community space, it's it's pretty logical to be like, we got to stop doing these bad things. Just don't do bad things anymore. That's just a very like clear, easy way to organize political power, and So that was very much my orientation for like the first 10 years of working in the space, was how do we stop doing bad things? And I eventually went back to grad school and realized climate change is one of the most complex things that you could ever think about or work on. Like we were saying earlier, that every discipline, every skill set, I made this joke earlier, I'm gonna recycle it. Yeah, with the exception of maybe comparative literature, I think every other discipline at Cornell is probably relevant to climate change. Apologies to the complet majors here. That level of complexity, I was realizing I was putting a lot of time, a lot of effort into trying to win on climate, and realizing I'm not 100% sure what we're doing is actually working. So I went back to school to learn more on the policy, on economics. I went a little bit deeper on the science than I had been, and I learned law a little bit better. So things that I hadn't gotten in my undergrad experience as much, just because that's not what I chose to do. And through that, I will credit Bill Nordhaus, who is now he's a Yale economist, and I think also a Nobel Prize winner now. He's a very, anyway, he's a lovely guy, but he's a little ornery. But so I took a class with him and just understood global energy markets and commodity markets in a different way. And anyone here who's an economist, this is obvious, but when oil is a global market, and the demand is not very elastic, right? Which means people need oil, and they're not switching off oil anytime soon. That's just the way we get around. That's what we use. And even if you don't want to use oil, you don't really have a choice. So you're going to use oil, the end. So if you stop producing oil in, let's say, the US, the demand still is there, and there's still money to be made. So Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or somebody else just supplies that oil. It's kind of like a big bathtub of oil. It doesn't matter if you turn off a spigot or turn on a spigot. Same amount of oil is going to get burned. Same amount of climate impact happens. So that was my first oh my God, I cannot believe no one told me this before. And this is a thing I keep saying to my colleagues in DC who just don't want to believe it, actually. But it is that fundamental shift and understanding of we have to really understand how markets work. We have to understand how the money gets exchanged. What are the incentives? What actually happens in the market? That is something that I think many folks who are drawn to the environmental movement tend to be, that's not usually where they come from. That's not the root of their motivation. Often the root of their motivation is that they love nature, they love wild places, or they're worried about resource constraints, or they're worried, there's other things that take you there. But now I want more company. In this place where I am not worried that much about the production of fossil fuels or the extraction of fossil fuels. There's real local impacts of that stuff that cannot be dismissed, right? So there's real land, water, air impacts from fossil fuel extraction, and so the communities that have to bear the burden of that's a real problem, and we need to figure out how to mitigate that. But that is different than a greenhouse gas problem, and that's hard for many folks to embrace.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work at Breakthrough Energy, particularly around the different categories of innovation that you'd like to see. I think a lot of people in this room work in many different disciplines, grapple with lots of different technological aspects of the decarbonization challenge. Would love to hear how Breakthrough Energy thinks about the different categories, what categories are of particular interest from the Inflation Reduction Act, and maybe you personally, what do you think is particularly interesting for people who might be thinking about what to go into or what to study or where to push the technological frontier?
Yeah, oh my God, I want to talk about this forever. Okay, so maybe I'll just pick 3 sectors. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, we'll start with power because I talked about power in this. I use, when I was at the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of my pet peeves about working at NRDC was that we had just an epic number of people working on power sector and not on like industrial emissions and like the transportation team was like actually pretty small. And, like there's so much focus on the power sector with good reason, actually. So it's funny that I want to start with power sector because I actually think there's a lot of work to do in the power sector still. Where I think we need just so much work there is on transmission, which I mentioned, and on clean firm power. The kind of the workhorse of decarbonization is going to be the power sector. So many solutions that we are counting on to get rid of fossil fuels require clean electricity to replace the natural gas that heats our homes. Like we need electric heat pumps instead of having natural gas furnaces. We need electric vehicles instead of using internal combustion engines. We need, like, so many of those basic things in our lives, we're assuming electricity will be there to power it. And if you notice, the whole 80% of our energy consumption is fossil fuels still, but most of the power sector is still powered by fossil fuels. So we're nowhere close to being at a 100% clean grid. And yet we're still expecting that we will not only increase our electricity demand by switching off of all these other fossil fuels, but that we'll somehow magically have a bunch of clean power available for that. That is just an enormous engineering challenge that we need to face, but it's also a huge political and regulatory challenge because folks, like if folks were, what's the way? I talk about like wind and solar as like the charismatic megafauna of climate change. Like people love to like work on moving wind and solar forward. And we need that. We need more deployment of wind and solar for sure. But like transmission is actually what you need to unlock all that clean energy because, the current grid capacity in the US is like something on the order of like 1.2-ish terawatts, give or take. And stuck in the interconnection queue, just like waiting to be approved and built, is 2.6 terawatts of renewable project ideas. And to be fair, some of those are not real. People know the queue's long, blah, 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 whatever. But that's a lot. That's like a lot of like very cost competitive, like economic projects that are just not able to connect to the grid because we can't build the transmission fast enough and we don't have the processes to get through the queue. And a lot, that's like a planning problem of going across regions. That is a permitting problem. We can't permit this stuff fast enough, and it's a problem of paying. Who's going to pay for it? Like, how do you allocate the cost and benefits? And then just my little hobby horse right now is there's a permitting bill right now that would make this a lot better. It would make it much easier to build transmission more quickly, which would unlock a huge amount of clean energy. And most of my friends in the environmental community oppose it fiercely, and they want to kill the bill. So that's a bummer, and that's why we need a different movement.
Great. That's a good segue because I actually am interested in talking a little bit about like your forward-looking sense of the politics of a lot of this stuff. My sense is that the Inflation Reduction Act, was passed and structured to have a level of durability, a political durability that maybe was absent in a more regulation-first world where Democrats would regulate, Republicans would come in and they'd lift those regulations. How are you thinking about the future of all of these federal funds and the tax credits under different scenarios that might happen? And how does it maybe interact or not interact with some of the permitting legislative dynamics that are also happening?
Yeah.
And how fares bipartisanship on these questions?
Bipartisanship, that's a good thing. Well, so I would say, so when the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted into law, a lot of modeling and studies came out, and like one was, Rhodium Group did one estimate, which was that, if we, in one of the most optimistic scenarios, we could achieve, our current Paris climate target is, I think, 50 to 52% by 2030 to cut our emissions 50 to 52% in like not that long from now, like in a few years. And so like their estimate was that IRA gets you to about 42%, which is not the whole way, but like that's a pretty good chunk to get to our maintaining our diplomatic leverage and being able to show our face at the UN and stuff. So That's huge. That's like an incredible amount to do. But they use NEMS, the National Energy Modeling System, which is a cost optimization model, which means it just assumes if the resource is cost effective, that it'll just come online, which is assuming basically like transmission will just happen all of a sudden, to go back to my first point. So those models are like super rosy in that it's like, yeah, this is assuming like, of course you'll just bring it online because it's like it's like cheaper to do that. But you cannot model for the permitting problems, the transmission build-up problem. So we can't realize that level of reductions. Like they're basically like we're leaving money on the table. There's money to build economic projects, and if we can't get the permitting reform bill done, if we can't build the transmission, then we are literally leaving money on the table for our clean energy transition. So that's why the permitting piece is hugely important to this. In terms of election scenarios in next year, so we, if we live in a rational place, then there should be nothing to worry about because these investments are, they will create jobs and create tax base in a lot of communities, mostly honestly in like red and purple states that tend to vote pretty conservatively because that's the places that have lots of land, they have lots of wind and sun, they are used to building big energy infrastructure projects, and frankly, their permitting rules are often a little bit easier to deal with at the state level. So Texas is like a huge example of like poised to benefit super well from these kinds of tax credits. The Great Plains states, all those So in a back in the days where Senator Chuck Grassley was the #1 proponent for the wind tax credit because Iowa was producing so much wind. The usual politics on tax credits has been it's pretty regional. It's based on this is going to be good for my state, and so therefore I'm going to protect it. So we're in a different universe today where the kind of partisan politics might mess up the rational politics. But I think a lot of us are working under the assumption that we can mobilize and engage members in a way that will ensure that that doesn't happen. There is next year a major tax negotiation where the Trump tax cuts from 2017 are expiring next year. So we assume Republicans are really going to want to renew those tax credits, which is very expensive to do. And so in that tax negotiation, it might be that they want to get rid of the clean energy tax credits to help pay for tax cuts for the wealthy. I personally don't want that to happen. So we're trying to figure out how do we make sure the voices who benefit from these tax credits, these clean energy tax credits, can communicate the real benefits and that there's real loss here if those are pulled back. So it's not just a partisan political fight, but it's a real economic dollars and cents issue.
That's great, thanks. We have some time for audience questions.
Oh, wait, sorry.
Oh, yes, please.
I have one other thing
Yeah.
To your earlier question that I didn't answer, which is on innovation, areas of innovation that I think are really important. So one thing that I just recently started thinking about a few months ago is, when you think about you start thinking about up to 2080, which no one's doing, but if you think about that, and we have some folks that do analysis for us who have a model that goes at 2080, it's who knows how accurate that is, but it's interesting to think about. But the basic thing that they're noting to us is that as Africa starts to develop, as some of these lower and middle income countries are developing, they're going to start urbanizing a lot more. People are going to start moving to cities, they're going to start developing in a different way. And the urbanization process means they're going to need a lot more cement, a lot more steel, a lot more glass, building materials. And for folks who are climate nerds, you probably know cement is 10% of global emissions. I mean, it's just a bananas amount of emissions comes from cement. And we have no really good way to make cement in a clean way. Also, the building codes all say you have to use Portland cement, so that's a whole other thing we got to fix. So there's the innovations needed on building materials, not just on how do we make cement and how do we make steel in a way that is totally zero carbon, but then also how do you get those markets to actually take root in Africa or India or in other places that are going to be urbanized. If you look at China's emissions, China's kind of already done the urbanization, so their huge emissions are starting to actually peak because they're just not producing as much cement or steel. Like, I think they're literally like taking actual factories and like relocating them into other continents, which is bananas. So, like that'll be the same curve for much of the world. So when I think about innovation, like that's something that I'm really, really concerned and thinking about, which is not that many people are worrying about that. So that's a real area for anyone who's into cement.
That's great. Maharsh, you want to grab that? Yeah. So we've got an opportunity to ask some questions. Maharsh can come around with a microphone. Yeah, what do you do up here?
Hi, I loved your talk. My name's Anya. I'm studying like master's in public health, actually, in environment, climate, and health. So it's like we're trying to talk about more climate and public health now. I just had a question about like lobbying for fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies, in terms of if transmission is established and like if renewable energy does get cheaper, what will you do? Like, does it have to outcompete the subsidies too? In order for people to actually start using it? Or do you think like policymakers will automatically like stop subsidizing and start using clean energy?
Yeah. The good news is that wind and solar are already cheaper than fossil fuels. So it's truly mostly an infrastructure problem. I mean, it depends on where you are, and there's like, they're definitely competitive. So it's really more of an infrastructure question and a electricity markets question of literally just like how the electricity curve works across, like when is peak load, and how do you make enough electrons to fulfill the demand throughout the 24-hour cycle. Your question on fossil fuel subsidies generally. We just did look into this because we were thinking about it in terms of like a rhetorical point on some of the tax stuff next year. But I think we were seeing that like direct fossil fuel subsidies are somewhere on the order of like $20 billion per year, which is definitely not nothing. But now that IRA and bill has passed, like it's at the subsidies is sort of on, more comparable. If anything, clean energy may be getting more direct subsidies. But that's, if I were in charge of things, there would be no dollars going to that, because that's like, why are you subsidizing these companies? Like, seems like they're doing great, so I don't know why they need it anymore. So that's like, that is definitely one thing. The other thing is the indirect subsidies, which is sort of like getting a good deal on like rather than charging for leases, giving them free leases, or like there's different things where you could be charging fossil fuels differently and like making revenue off of like fossil fuel drilling on public land, stuff like that, where there's like wildly different estimates on that. That could be much, much, much more money. And that's just like another benefit of fossil fuel companies. But ultimately, when it comes to the, even with that in place, wind and solar are cheaper. But to the larger long-term question, like, we have to get rid of those fossil fuel subsidies for all the other kinds of clean energy solutions that are not cost competitive to be able to compete. So like that's going to need to level out.
So hi, my name is Sophia, and I'm an engineering physics student here, and I actually worked at a fusion energy company this summer. And
Which one?
Commonwealth Fusion Systems.
CFS, yeah.
Yeah, it was honestly an awesome experience. But so when I was there, they talked a lot about when we actually achieve this really cheap, clean energy, how it will change the economy, how it'll change poverty across the world. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that and show and talk about how when energy is no longer this really expensive, really damaging thing, how the world will change. Yeah,
I think basically we won't have to feel bad anymore, So I've said this a few times today, actually, that for the last 20 years of my career, when fusion was raised, I sort of would roll my eyes and move on. So it just hasn't been taken seriously for a long time. But because of Commonwealth Fusion Systems and some other startups that are showing real promise in terms of the technology and are looking like they might be able to put real electrons on the grid in like a 2030-ish time frame, 2032 time frame. It's definitely worth looking at, and the way the government is putting money into fusion currently doesn't make any sense, and I'm excited about trying to get them to change it to be more commercially focused. That'll say, I mean, yeah, fusion would be a game changer if it really works out. But it's so far in the early stage still that like there's a tax credit that it will qualify for. And actually, the CEO of Commonwealth Fusion Systems came to a dinner that we held recently. Bill's a big fan of him, actually, and Bob, right? And he, he was noting during this dinner, it's like, he doesn't really need tax credits for fusion. What he needs is demonstration money. He needs like the earlier stage stuff to get this stuff off the ground. The tax credits is not that helpful to him. So that it's very clear it's like you need a whole range of federal funding to make those things happen. But yeah, I mean, like if we have cheap, plentiful energy available in every region of the world, yeah, I can go bake. I can start baking cakes. I don't need this anymore. That would be like that'd be a huge game changer.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Kate. I'm a junior studying environment sustainability. So you mentioned how you want to shorten the innovation timeline, but I think when it comes to environmental solutions, when we are shortening the scientific process and like the cyclical nature of that, a lot of times there can be drastic consequences. So especially when you're implementing green infrastructure, like how are we supposed to mitigate climate gentrification?
How are we supposed to mitigate climate gentrification?
Yeah.
Wait, can you say more about what you mean?
Yeah. Well, like for example, in Hawaii, when all the wildfires were happening, because like power lines, the electric company decided to create this project where they're essentially undergrounding all the power lines. But no matter what green infrastructure you're implementing, it can increase property values. So after the wildfires, a lot of people were not able to buy back their property or move back because wealthier people are coming in and buying it because it's more expensive and no one can afford it anymore, especially people in the BIPOC community.
Yeah. That probably is going to be like a local by local, case by case situation. I think of this just more as how do we fulfill the demand for energy given most of our energy source is killing the climate. So within that, there's going to be distributional impacts and all kinds of trade-offs across multiple areas. And there's a lot of really tough policy decisions and really tough value judgments that need to be made about like where do we need to make. There's no way that we're going to be able to solve climate change in a way that 100% is how everybody agrees we should do it, right? So there's no way that's going to happen. So the question becomes like, should we do nothing because then no one can feel bad about having done a bad thing, or should we still try to get to net zero emissions because such a huge amount of the world will suffer under a 4-degree Celsius increase under like that. There's so it's like most of climate change. The toughest thing is going to be the trade-offs. Is like how do you weigh those?
Hi there. I'm a freshman studying biological sciences. I'm curious about what you said about the transition from focusing on stopping harmful behavior versus, focusing on expanding. And obviously, that pitch is an easier pill to swallow. It's easier to imagine ourselves, living the same lifestyles, not having to make any sacrifices. But mainly just like changing how we're doing it. I'm curious do you honestly think that that is like scalable in time for us to avoid climate tipping points that will take it out of our hands? And B, do you think that alone will be enough to stop the impacts of climate change and to save our societies from the impacts of climate change without having to make significant reductions in using energy, period, or using resources, period?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that so I kind of separate like the way we should be doing things versus the way things are. And part of the way that I perceive this is it doesn't matter whether we should or shouldn't live our lives in a certain way. The question is like I don't even know how many billions of people live on this planet right now, but they want air conditioning. So like it's really hard to tell like India and Pakistan, like so sorry, you don't get to have enough electricity to cool your buildings, even though the heat is going to kill you because, it's just not good for us. Like we have to be realistic about the fact that all of these countries and these economies are going to be developing, and restraining their development is honestly not a very just outcome, but it's also not feasible. So given that, I mean, we can talk about the US all day about like, should we be like living more small? Should we be like driving less? Should we be doing less stuff? 100% sure. And honestly, like that's a little bit of a rounding error when you think about the actual global emissions that are coming from the entire, like the population of the planet, and the emissions that are gonna really be the driver of like catastrophic change is going to be the ones that's like lifting people out of poverty so that they can actually have sustainable lives. So so like a lot of effort can go into like getting people to change their lifestyle and to live more small. Like this is actually where I started when I came to Cornell. This is literally, I was like, people need to recycle more, everyone should be a vegetarian, like we should be like buying sustainable clothes. Like I was very, very much like in a, how do we live better lives? And through being at Cornell, I was like, oh, you can get people to drive less, but actually if the cars were all fuel efficient or didn't burn gas, that's actually a lot easier. And I started like moving more toward the policy side because I realized like the system, it's a system that you live in that's much more determinative than the lifestyle.
I understand that, but do you think that alone will be enough?
That what alone will be enough?
That kind of energy transition will supply us with enough like reduction in carbon emissions to keep us going?
I think it has to be. Like I don't think there's a choice.
Hello. So I'm a first-year MS student in the mechanical engineering department. I'm planning to specialize in energy and sustainability. So before I ask my question, I had something to ask about Breakthrough. Breakthrough is primarily the work of Breakthrough is to invest in clean energy projects, right?
Yes, there's
Like-
part of, not my side of Breakthrough, but another side of Breakthrough invests in clean energy, yeah.
Yeah, so after my undergrad, I had a gap year, and I was in Bangalore. And one thing I was doing there, because I was interested in the field, I used to go to these climate mixers or climate tech events. So Bangalore, if you don't know, is a big VC private equity hub in India. And what I'd seen there is that the number of AI or that kind of software mixers and meets would be like 10 times the climate meets. And the amount of energy or the participation in these climate meets would also be like, there would be a really large gap. And I did get to talk to a lot of VCs in these places. And it seemed that even the one who, like there are a lot of big VC and private equity funds who are not investing in climate are coming out right now because some points were like the investments, the returns are so long, pending, not as significant or exponential as you can find in AI or something. So my question is basically, how do you convince somebody who has a lot of funds or any investor to put their money in this risky and long-term investment rather than putting it in AI or software, especially in places like India or the developing world where the resources are scant? So,
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot of different kinds of investment, right? There's like venture capital, there's like, growth equity, there's, institutional investors. But on the venture capital side, one of the reasons Bill started the venture side of Breakthrough was that he saw the need for this kind of like patient capital, like this concept of like folks who care a lot about climate and have money and aren't looking for a return immediately, but are willing to kind of like wait a long time to see if this will pan out. Energy just works differently than software and these other kinds of industries. So you just can't expect the same type of investment return or timeline. So that's why he like went to a bunch of high net worth individuals to create this fund, was because like these are people who are, they're not, it's not for their pensions. They're just like, they've got a lot of money and they are patient and they care about climate. It's in terms of like how to get more VCs or more folks interested in it. I mean, I think like proving the concepts, like seeing some successes will help, because most investors actually just want to make money. And so you have to be able to see how they're going to make money off of it. And so one thing is just like proving success through existing funds, and a lot more. I mean, when Breakthrough Energy Ventures started, it was like kind of the only game in town doing that. There's a lot more doing it, and it keeps growing. So that's pretty heartening. The other thing I'll say is like on the policy and regulatory front, when you shape the policy rules for the market to move toward decarbonization, it becomes clearer how you will make money off it, and it'll be easier for investors to put money there. So that's why I work on that part, which is, investors aren't going to work based on morals. They're going to work based on what's going to be a return. If you shape the policy rules so that they get a return, you will suddenly see capital flowing in that direction. And so that's how we focus our work, is how do we shape that market to move that way.
All right. So really appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And
Thank
thank you
you.
again for Aliya.